This morning, the urgent murder investigation after an Ohio dentist and his wife were found shot to death in their home, their two small children inside but unharmed. Police responding to the Columbus, Ohio residence of 37-year-old Dr. Spencer Tepe and his wife, 39-year-old Monique, around 9:30 a.m. Tuesday after his boss called in a welfare check when he didn't show up to work.
He is always on time, and this is very out of character. And we can't get in touch with his wife, which is probably the more concerning thing.
Police knocking on the door, but no answer. About a half hour later, concerned friends showed up and called 911 again.
I can hear kids inside, and I swear I think I heard one yell, but we can't get in.
Moments later, a friend calling authorities back, saying he could see Spencer's body inside the home.
There's a body. He's laying next to his bed, off of his bed, and there's blood.
The couple seen here in their 2021 wedding video. Police say this does not appear to be a murder-suicide, and there were no signs of forced entry. The murder weapon has not yet been recovered.
I know that's a lot of questions still out there. It's very early for us to try to answer those right now.
Investigators are now interviewing friends, family, and neighbors as they piece together the couple's final hours. Police say there's no suspect yet, and they're asking anyone with information to come forward.
The crying was the first thing they heard. It was early morning on December 30, 2025, when officers arrived at a quiet home in the Weinland Park neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio. From outside the house, everything looked normal. No broken windows. No signs of a struggle. But inside, two small children were crying, and they had been alone for hours. When officers finally made their way upstairs, they found something that immediately turned a routine welfare check into a homicide investigation. In the bedroom, Monique Tepe and her husband, Dr. Spencer Tepe, were lying on the floor. Both had been shot, multiple times. Later, investigators would reveal something even more disturbing. Monique had been shot 9 times. Spencer had been shot 7 times. 16 gunshots in total. But the most chilling part of the scene was what detectives noticed next. There were no signs of forced entry. Whoever had entered the house that night had either been invited in or already knew how to get inside. Downstairs, their 4-year-old daughter and 1-year-old son were still alive, sleeping only a few rooms away from where the murders happened. At first, investigators wondered if this was a robbery, but nothing inside the house appeared to be stolen. Then detectives began looking deeper into Monique's past, and that's when they discovered a name. A man who lived hundreds of miles away, a respected vascular surgeon, and someone Monique had once been married to. But what investigators would later uncover suggested that the person responsible may have been watching the house weeks before the murders even happened. And if that was true, then what happened inside that Columbus home may not have been spontaneous. It may have been planned. Welcome back. In today's case of the day, we are looking into the disturbing double homicide of Monique Tepe and Dr. Spencer Tepe in Columbus, Ohio. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let us get into it. In the early hours of December 30, 2025, the Weinland Park neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, was quiet. It was the kind of winter night that most people slept through without noticing anything unusual. The streets were calm, the houses dark, and the only sounds were the occasional passing car or the distant hum of traffic from nearby roads. Inside one of those homes lived a young family whose lives, from the outside, appeared stable and full of promise. Dr. Spencer Tepe was a dentist in Columbus. Colleagues described him as dedicated to his work and attentive to his patients. He had built a reputation as someone who took pride in his profession and his responsibilities. His schedule was often busy, but friends said he still made time for his family. His wife, Monique Tepe, was known among friends and family as someone energetic and warm. She was devoted to her children and deeply involved in her family life. Those who knew her often described her as the kind of person who kept people laughing during gatherings and celebrations. The couple had married in 2020 and were raising 2 young children together in their Columbus home. Their house sat in the Weinland Park area, a neighborhood located just north of downtown Columbus. The community had a mix of older homes and newer renovations, and many families lived there. It was a place where neighbors knew each other and where many people expected a sense of safety. On the night of December 29, 2025, nothing about the Tepe household appeared out of the ordinary. Friends later told reporters that the couple had been living what seemed like a normal life. They were raising their children, working and planning for the future. The holidays had just passed, and like many families, they were settling back into their routines as the new year approached. But sometime during the early morning hours of December 30, something happened inside that house that would soon shock an entire community. Investigators would later estimate that the murders occurred sometime between approximately 2 in the morning and 5 in the morning. During those hours, most of the neighborhood was asleep. Surveillance cameras positioned in parts of the area would later capture a figure walking through an alley behind the Tepe home. The person appeared to be wearing a dark hoodie and moving quietly through the area. The footage was grainy, but investigators believed it showed someone walking near the house around the time frame of the suspected killings. At that moment, no one in the neighborhood realized anything unusual had taken place. Inside the Tepe home, Spencer and Monique were upstairs in their bedroom. What happened next would later be described in investigative documents as a violent attack. Autopsy findings later revealed that both victims had been shot multiple times. Monique Tepe sustained 9 gunshot wounds. Spencer Tepe sustained 7. 16 shots in total. Authorities would later say that the violence of the attack suggested that the killings were not random. The children were inside the house during the attack. Downstairs, their 4-year-old daughter and 1-year-old son remained alive and unharmed. They were only a few rooms away from where the shooting occurred. As the night passed and the morning approached, the home remained quiet. No one outside the house knew what had happened. Morning eventually arrived in Columbus on December 30. Across the city, people were beginning their day. Commuters were heading to work, parents were preparing their children for school, and businesses were opening their doors. At the dental office where Spencer Tepe worked, colleagues began to notice something unusual. Spencer had not arrived. According to people who worked with him, this was highly unusual. Spencer was known to be reliable when it came to his schedule. Staff members attempted to reach him. Phone calls went unanswered. As the hours passed, concern began to grow. Eventually, someone close to the situation contacted authorities and requested a welfare check at the Tepe home. Police officers were dispatched to check on the residents in the Weinland Park neighborhood. However, an unexpected mistake delayed the discovery of what had happened. According to reports later shared with the public, officers initially went to the wrong address. That error cost valuable time. Eventually, a friend of the couple arrived at the correct location. The friend had become concerned after not hearing from Spencer and Monique. When he approached the house, he noticed something troubling. From inside, he could hear the sound of children crying. The house itself appeared quiet. There were no obvious signs of a disturbance from the outside, but the sound of the crying children suggested that something inside was not right. Authorities soon entered the home. What they discovered inside immediately changed the situation from a welfare check to a homicide investigation. Officers made their way upstairs. In the bedroom, they found Spencer and Monique Tepe. Both had suffered fatal gunshot wounds. The scene was immediately secured, and investigators began examining the home for evidence. Meanwhile, officers located the two children downstairs. The children were alive and physically unharmed. They were removed from the home and placed in the care of authorities. For investigators, the discovery of the children alive inside the house raised difficult questions. The first question was how someone could enter the house, commit such a violent act, and leave without harming anyone else. The second question was how the person had gained access to the home in the first place. When detectives began looking for signs of forced entry, they found none. Doors and windows did not appear to have been broken. Nothing suggested that the killer had forced their way inside. That detail quickly became one of the most important aspects of the investigation. If there had been no forced entry, investigators had to consider the possibility that the victims either knew the person who entered the home or that the person had some other way of accessing the house. Another detail also stood out. Nothing inside the home appeared to have been stolen. There were no obvious signs of robbery. The scene suggested that whoever carried out the attack had come for a specific purpose. The news of the killings quickly began to spread through Columbus. Neighbors were shocked. Many described the neighborhood as peaceful and family-oriented. Some residents said they had not heard gunshots during the night. Others said they had slept through the entire incident without realizing what had happened nearby. As investigators worked the scene, they began collecting evidence and interviewing people connected to the victims. Detectives from the Columbus Division of Police began reconstructing the timeline of the night. They reviewed surveillance footage from nearby homes and streets. They spoke with neighbors to determine whether anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. They also began examining the personal histories of the victims. In many homicide investigations, detectives start by looking at the people closest to the victims. Family members, friends, former partners, colleagues, anyone who might have had a motive or a connection to the victims' lives. At first, investigators focused on understanding who Spencer and Monique Tepe were. Friends described them as social and active in their community. Spencer was known for his dental work and professional dedication. Monique was known for her vibrant personality and strong connection to her family and friends. The couple had built a life together in Columbus. But as detectives dug deeper into Monique's past, they discovered that she had been married before. That earlier relationship would soon draw the attention of investigators. Police began looking into Monique's previous marriage to a man named Michael David McKee. McKee was a vascular surgeon. He had once been married to Monique years before she met Spencer. Their marriage had ended in divorce. Investigators began examining whether that past relationship had any connection to what had happened in the Tepe home. At that point in the investigation, police had very little information about who might have committed the murders. But they did know one thing. The killings appeared to be targeted, and the lack of forced entry suggested that whoever had entered the home that night might have known exactly where they were going. As the investigation continued, detectives began reviewing surveillance footage collected from around the neighborhood. It was during this review that they noticed something unusual. A person walking through an alley behind the Tepe home during the time frame investigators believed the murders occurred. The individual was wearing a hoodie and moving quietly through the area. The footage was not clear enough to immediately identify the person, but it gave investigators a new lead. They began studying the footage closely, trying to determine whether the person had entered or exited the property. They also began tracing vehicles seen in the area during the early morning hours. Each piece of footage, each timestamp, and each observation became part of the puzzle investigators were trying to solve. Meanwhile, the Columbus community continued to react to the shocking news. Local media outlets began reporting on the case. Residents expressed concern about safety in the neighborhood. Many wondered who could have committed such a violent act inside a family home. For the investigators working the case, the focus remained on gathering evidence and building a timeline. They knew that somewhere within the details of that night, the surveillance footage, the phone records, the movements of vehicles, there might be clues pointing to the person responsible. And as detectives continued examining Monique's past and the people connected to her life, one name began appearing more frequently in the investigation: Michael David McKee. At that point, investigators had not publicly named a suspect. But as they reviewed surveillance footage, travel records, and personal histories, their attention slowly began turning toward Monique's former husband. The question detectives now faced was whether that connection was simply part of her past, or whether it could somehow explain what had happened inside the Tepe home during the early morning hours of December 30. And as the investigation continued, detectives would soon uncover information suggesting that the person responsible might not have arrived at that house by chance. They might have been watching it long before the night of the murders. The news of the double homicide spread quickly across Columbus. By the afternoon of December 30, 2025, the quiet street in the Weinland Park neighborhood had transformed into an active crime scene. Yellow police tape surrounded the Tepe home, patrol vehicles lined the block, and investigators moved carefully in and out of the residence collecting evidence. For the detectives assigned to the case, the first hours after the discovery were critical. Every homicide investigation begins with a simple question: what happened here? Inside the Tepe home, detectives started documenting the scene in detail. Photographs were taken. Evidence markers were placed. Officers carefully searched for anything that could help explain how two people had been killed inside their own home, while their children slept only a few rooms away. The brutality of the crime was immediately clear. Both victims had been shot multiple times. The bedroom showed signs of a violent confrontation that had unfolded quickly and decisively. Investigators knew from experience that the number of shots fired could sometimes indicate something important about the motive behind a crime. This did not appear to be a robbery that had gone wrong. Nothing inside the house suggested that the killer had been searching for valuables. Jewelry, electronics, and other personal items appeared to still be in place. Another detail also stood out. There were no signs that the killer had forced their way inside. Detectives checked the doors and windows of the home. None appeared to have been broken or tampered with. The absence of forced entry suggested that whoever had entered the house had either been allowed inside or had known how to access the property. That realization narrowed the possibilities. If the attack had not been random, investigators needed to understand the lives of the victims. Could 16 gunshots be fired inside a home without anyone nearby noticing? One possibility was that the weapon used in the attack had been equipped with some form of suppressor. Investigators did not immediately confirm that publicly, but the possibility remained part of the investigative discussion. As officers continued processing the home, another team began reviewing surveillance footage from cameras in the area. Modern neighborhoods often contain dozens of cameras, doorbell cameras, security systems, and street cameras that can capture the movement of people and vehicles throughout the night. Detectives began collecting video from houses surrounding the Tepe residence. They hoped the cameras might reveal who had approached the home during the hours when the murders were believed to have taken place. At the same time, investigators began reconstructing the final hours of Spencer and Monique's lives. They looked at phone records, messages, and recent activity. They also began building a list of people who had interacted with the couple in the days leading up to the murders. In many homicide investigations, the people closest to the victims often become the first focus. Police began speaking with friends and relatives to understand the couple's relationships. Those interviews painted a picture of a family that appeared happy and stable. Spencer was focused on his dental practice and his role as a father. Monique was deeply connected to her children and maintained strong relationships with her friends. There were no immediate reports of recent arguments or conflicts that could explain the attack. Still, detectives knew that understanding the past was often the key to understanding the present. They began reviewing Monique's history, including relationships that had ended years earlier. One of those relationships soon drew the attention of investigators. Before marrying Spencer, Monique had been married to another man. His name was Michael David McKee. McKee was a vascular surgeon. According to public records, he and Monique had married in 2015. The marriage, however, did not last long. By 2017, the relationship had ended in divorce. At first glance, the marriage appeared to be part of Monique's past. But as detectives began speaking with people who knew the couple during that time, they heard stories that suggested the relationship had not ended peacefully. Several individuals told investigators that Monique had expressed fear of her former husband during and after the marriage. Some witnesses said McKee had allegedly made threats toward her. These statements would later become part of court documents as investigators examined whether the past relationship might be connected to the present case. At that stage of the investigation, police had not publicly identified any suspects, but they continued examining every possible lead. Meanwhile, the review of surveillance footage around the neighborhood began producing results. Investigators noticed something unusual on
Spencer
cameras
and Monique
positioned
Tepe were
near the
found
Tepe
shot
home.
to death in their Weinland Park
One of the most
home on
important
December 30th.
aspects of the investigation
Now, the autopsy
involved
reports are
tracking
shedding some
vehicles
light
captured
what
on
was
nearby
truly
cameras.
A vicious crime.
Cars
Vicious
that
crime.
passed through the
Vicious
neighborhood
crime.
during the early
Vicious
morning
crime.
hours
Vicious
were
crime.
examined closely.
Vicious crime. Vicious
Detectives
crime.
looked for
Vicious
vehicles
crime.
that did not
Vicious
belong
crime.
to residents
Vicious
of the
crime.
area.
Vicious crime.
Among the
Vicious
footage,
crime.
they reviewed were cameras positioned along streets leading toward and away from the Tepe home. As investigators compared footage from multiple cameras, they began noticing a vehicle that appeared at several points during the time frame of the murders. The car was seen traveling through the area and later leaving. Detectives worked to determine who the vehicle belonged to. Vehicle registrations and travel records were examined. Investigators traced the vehicle to a name that had already appeared in their investigation: Michael David McKee. The discovery did not immediately prove involvement in the murders, but it raised significant questions. McKee was known to be living and working in Illinois. The idea that a vehicle connected to him might have been present in Columbus around the time of the murders prompted detectives to dig deeper. Investigators began examining travel records, electronic data, and other forms of evidence that might confirm whether McKee had been in Ohio during that period. They also reviewed older surveillance footage collected earlier in the month. During that review, detectives discovered something else that concerned them. Video from early December showed a man approaching the Tepe residence while the family was away. According to information later released in court documents, Spencer and Monique had been out of town attending the Big Ten championship game when the footage was recorded. The person seen on camera appeared to walk onto the property and approach the house. Investigators believed the individual might have been examining the property. For detectives, that discovery raised the possibility that the killer had been watching the home weeks before the murders occurred. If that was true, the crime may not have been spontaneous. It may have been planned. As investigators continued building the timeline, they also looked into McKee's phone activity. According to investigative records, McKee's cell phone had remained at his workplace during the time frame of the murders. The device showed little to no movement for many hours. Detectives considered the possibility that leaving the phone behind could have been an attempt to prevent the device from tracking the owner's location. At the same time, law enforcement agencies began coordinating across state lines. If McKee had traveled from Illinois to Ohio, it would mean the suspect had crossed several hundred miles before arriving in Columbus. Authorities began working with agencies outside Ohio to determine where McKee might be located. While investigators pursued those leads, the community continued following developments closely. Memorials for Spencer and Monique began appearing in Columbus. Friends and neighbors gathered to remember the couple and express support for their children and extended family. The tragedy had left 2 young children without their parents. Family members stepped in to care for them as the investigation continued. For the detectives assigned to the case, the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. The surveillance footage, the vehicle, the earlier appearance at the home, the past relationship between Monique and her former husband. Each detail pointed investigators closer to a possible explanation for what had happened inside the Tepe home. But before they could bring the case forward, detectives needed to confirm where Michael David McKee was and whether the evidence would be strong enough to connect him directly to the murders. And as authorities continued tracking his movements, they would soon locate him hundreds of miles away from Columbus. The next step in the investigation would take place in another state. By the first week of January 2026, detectives working the Tepe homicide investigation had begun to see the outlines of a possible motive. The pieces of evidence they had gathered were beginning to form a pattern. It started with the surveillance footage. Then came the vehicle. Then the earlier video from December that showed a man approaching the Tepe home while the family was out of town. And finally, the background investigation into Monique Tepe's past relationship. All of it seemed to point in one direction: Michael David McKee. For investigators, McKee was no ordinary suspect. He was a vascular surgeon, a highly trained physician who had spent years studying medicine and building a professional career. Colleagues who knew him through the medical field described him as intelligent and accomplished. But detectives knew that a person's professional status did not automatically rule them out of a criminal investigation. What mattered to investigators were the facts. And the facts were beginning to reveal a complicated history between McKee and Monique. According to public records, McKee and Monique had married in 2015. The marriage, however, did not last long. Within 2 years, the relationship had ended in divorce. For many couples, divorce represents the end of a chapter and the beginning of separate lives. But in some cases, the emotional aftermath can continue long after the legal process is finished. By the time Monique met Spencer Tepe, friends said she had been ready to move forward with her life. The two developed a relationship that eventually led to marriage in 2020. Those who knew the couple said they appeared deeply committed to one another. They built a family together and settled into life in Columbus. But investigators were beginning to ask whether someone from Monique's past had been watching that life from a distance. The surveillance footage collected earlier in the investigation became increasingly important. One video in particular showed a man approaching the Tepe home on December 6, 2025. At the time, the house had been empty. Spencer and Monique had traveled out of town to attend the Big Ten championship football game. The person seen on the footage walked toward the property, paused near the house, and then eventually left the area. Detectives began analyzing the images carefully. Although the footage did not provide a clear view of the individual's face, investigators compared the person's build and movements with other images collected during the investigation. Meanwhile, another team of detectives was reviewing the vehicle data they had gathered from nearby cameras. That vehicle had appeared in multiple locations during the time frame of the murders. When investigators traced the registration of the car, they found it was linked to Michael David McKee. This discovery significantly changed the direction of the case. McKee was known to be working in Illinois. If the vehicle connected to him had been present in Columbus during the early morning hours of December 30, it meant someone had traveled hundreds of miles. The distance between Rockford, Illinois, and Columbus, Ohio, is approximately 450 miles. That is a journey of around 6 to 7 hours by car. Detectives now had to determine whether McKee himself had made that trip. Investigators began examining travel data and other digital evidence that might reveal his movements. One of the most important pieces of information involved McKee's cell phone. According to investigative findings, McKee's phone had remained at his workplace in Illinois during the time frame of the murders. At first glance, that detail might have suggested he had not left the area. But detectives quickly realized something unusual. The phone had remained inactive for an extended period of time. For investigators experienced in analyzing digital evidence, that raised an important possibility. The phone may have been intentionally left behind. Leaving a device in one location while traveling elsewhere is sometimes used to create the appearance that a person never left the area. Detectives continued reviewing travel records, vehicle movements, and surveillance footage. The pattern that emerged suggested that someone driving a vehicle connected to McKee had been in the Columbus area shortly before the murders and had left shortly afterward. As investigators gathered more evidence, they began coordinating with law enforcement agencies in Illinois. Authorities in both states shared information as detectives worked to determine where McKee was currently located. The investigation had now expanded beyond Columbus. Meanwhile, the story continued to draw national attention. News reports across the country began covering the case. Many people were struck by the contrast between the victims and the suspected motive. A family home, 2 young children left alive, a double homicide that appeared to have been carefully planned, and a suspect who was not an unknown stranger but a successful surgeon. As investigators prepared to take the next step, they needed to locate McKee. Law enforcement agencies began searching for him in the area where he was believed to be living and working. Their search eventually led them to Rockford, Illinois. Rockford is a city located about 90 miles northwest of Chicago. It was there that McKee had been working at a medical facility. Detectives coordinated with local authorities to monitor his movements. They needed to ensure that when they approached him, they had enough evidence to support an arrest. By this stage of the investigation, detectives believed they had gathered enough information to move forward. The surveillance footage, the vehicle linked to him, the earlier video from December, the history between McKee and Monique. Each piece of evidence had contributed to building a clearer picture of the events surrounding the murders. On January 10, 2026, law enforcement officers in Rockford took action. Michael David McKee was taken into custody. Authorities announced that he had been arrested in connection with the killings of Monique and Spencer Tepe. The arrest marked a major development in the case. But for investigators, the work was far from over. Following the arrest, McKee was charged with multiple criminal counts related to the murders. Prosecutors in Ohio prepared to bring the case to court. McKee would eventually be transported from Illinois to Ohio, to face the charges. The legal process would determine whether the evidence gathered by investigators would be enough to prove what happened inside the Tepe home. Meanwhile, the community in Columbus continued to mourn the loss of Spencer and Monique. Friends described the couple as loving parents who had built a life centered around their children. Their deaths had left a void not only in their family, but also among the many people who had known them. For the children who had been inside the home that night, the tragedy would shape the rest of their lives. Family members stepped in to care for them while the legal process moved forward. As the case entered the court system, prosecutors began outlining the charges against McKee. According to authorities, he faced multiple counts of aggravated murder. If convicted, the penalties could be severe. But before the case could reach a final outcome, the courts would need to examine the evidence in detail. The coming months would reveal more about what investigators believed had happened during the early hours of December 30. And as the legal proceedings unfolded, the public would learn more about the events that led to one of the most shocking double homicide cases in Columbus in recent years. The arrest of Michael David McKee on January 10, 2026, marked a turning point in the investigation into the deaths of Monique and Spencer Tepe. For 10 days, detectives had been working almost non-stop, piecing together surveillance footage, travel records, witness statements, and digital evidence. Each detail had slowly built a clearer picture of what investigators believed had happened during the early morning hours of December 30 in the Weinland Park neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio. When the arrest was announced, it confirmed what many investigators had already suspected. Authorities believed the killings were not random. They believed they were targeted. After McKee was taken into custody in Rockford, Illinois, the next step was transporting him back to Ohio, where prosecutors were preparing to formally present the charges in court. The legal process began quickly.
Hey, let's call your first case, please.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Stephen Schott, Dan Leonard, Shayla Faber for the state. First case before the court, State of Ohio versus Michael McKee. It's 26 CR 253. There are 5 counts. 4 counts of aggravated murder, unclassified felonies, and 1 count of aggravated burglary, felony 1. Each of these counts come with a 3 and a 6-year firearm specification.
Thank you. Counsel, please make your appearance.
Thank you, Your Honor. Diane Menashe on behalf of Michael McKee.
Thank you.
Your Honor, with respect to the allegations, we would acknowledge receipt, waive reading, enter not guilty pleas to all counts contained therein. We would also waive bond at this time, although we certainly reserve the right to raise that at a later date. The plea of not guilty form has been executed and signed on behalf of my client. Nothing further.
Thank you, counsel. I've signed the not guilty plea. I'm signing the bond form indicating that bond has been waived. Anything further?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you. Next case, please.
Prosecutors in Franklin County announced that McKee would face multiple charges connected to the deaths of Monique and Spencer Tepe. The charges included 4 counts of aggravated murder and 1 count of aggravated burglary. Each charge reflected a specific aspect of the crime investigators believed had occurred. Aggravated murder charges are among the most serious offenses under Ohio law. The additional burglary charge suggested that prosecutors believed McKee had unlawfully entered the Tepe residence with the intent to commit a violent crime. As the case moved forward, prosecutors began revealing more information about the evidence that investigators had gathered. One of the most significant pieces of evidence involved surveillance footage collected from the neighborhood where the murders occurred. Earlier in the investigation, detectives had identified a figure walking through an alley behind the Tepe home during the time frame when the murders were believed to have taken place. The footage had been released to the public during the investigation, prompting numerous tips from viewers who thought they recognized the person. While the video itself did not clearly identify the individual's face, investigators believed the clothing, movement, and location of the figure were important details. The footage helped establish that someone had been near the house during the early morning hours. Another critical piece of evidence involved vehicle tracking. Detectives had spent days reviewing footage from traffic cameras and residential security cameras in the area surrounding the Tepe home. Those cameras captured multiple vehicles traveling through the neighborhood during the night of the murders. One vehicle in particular drew the attention of investigators. The vehicle appeared to enter the area shortly before the suspected time frame of the killings and leave afterward. When detectives traced the registration information connected to that vehicle, it led them to Michael David McKee. That discovery prompted investigators to look deeper into McKee's recent movements. According to information later presented in court documents, detectives believed McKee had traveled from Illinois to Ohio shortly before the murders occurred. The drive between Rockford, Illinois, and Columbus, Ohio, is approximately 450 miles. For investigators, that raised a critical question. If McKee had made the trip, when had he done it? To answer that question, detectives examined digital evidence and travel patterns. Another important element of the investigation involved McKee's cell phone activity. Records showed that his phone had remained at his workplace during the time frame when the murders occurred. At first glance, that detail might have suggested he was still in Illinois. But investigators noticed something unusual. The phone showed little activity during that period. Detectives considered the possibility that the phone had been intentionally left behind. Leaving a device in one location while traveling elsewhere could prevent investigators from easily tracking someone's movements through cellular data. The possibility that the phone had been deliberately left behind became part of the case prosecutors began assembling. Investigators also examined earlier surveillance footage that had been collected during the investigation. That footage showed a man approaching the Tepe residence on December 6, 2025, several weeks before the murders. At that time, Spencer and Monique had been out of town attending the Big Ten championship football game. The person captured in the video walked toward the property and appeared to approach the house before eventually leaving. For detectives, that footage raised the possibility that someone had been studying the home before the night of the killings. If true, it would suggest planning and preparation. Prosecutors later described the case as one involving premeditation. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining the history between Monique Tepe and her former husband. Witnesses who knew the couple during their earlier marriage provided statements to authorities describing tensions during the relationship. Some witnesses told investigators that Monique had expressed fear of McKee during the years after their divorce. According to statements included in court documents, some individuals said McKee had allegedly made threatening remarks toward Monique in the past. Those statements became part of the evidence prosecutors used to explain a possible motive. But even with those details, investigators knew that building a legal case required more than suspicion. They needed to connect the evidence directly to the crimes. As the case moved into the court system, prosecutors began outlining how they believed the events had unfolded. They argued that the evidence showed McKee had traveled to Columbus, entered the Tepe home during the early morning hours of December 30, and carried out the shootings before leaving the area. Defense attorneys representing McKee maintained that their client was not responsible for the murders. As with all criminal cases in the United States, McKee was presumed innocent unless proven guilty in court. During early court proceedings, McKee entered a plea of not guilty to the charges. The case would now move through the legal process, which could take months or even years before reaching a final resolution. A jury would examine the facts. Witnesses would testify. Evidence would be presented and challenged. Only after that process would a final verdict be reached. Until then, the story of what happened inside the Tepe home remained a case moving through the courts. For the families involved, the focus remained on remembering the lives that had been lost and caring for the children who had survived. For the community in Columbus, the case served as a reminder that tragedies can occur even in places that seem peaceful and familiar. And for investigators, the case represented the culmination of weeks of work to uncover what happened during the early morning hours of December 30, 2025. The answers they believed they had discovered would now be tested in court. The legal process would determine whether the evidence gathered by detectives could prove what prosecutors alleged had occurred. But regardless of the outcome, the impact of the tragedy had already been felt. A quiet neighborhood had been shaken. 2 young children had lost their parents. And a case that began with a simple welfare check had become one of the most widely discussed homicide investigations in Columbus in recent years. The final chapter of the story would not be written by investigators or reporters. It would be written in a courtroom where the facts of the case would be examined and justice would ultimately be decided. As this case continues through the legal system, many questions may still be answered in court. Evidence will be examined, testimony will be heard, and the legal process will ultimately determine responsibility for what happened inside that Columbus home. But beyond the investigation, beyond the charges, and beyond the courtroom, there are 2 lives that cannot be replaced. Monique Tepe and Dr. Spencer Tepe were more than names in a headline. They were parents, they were friends, they were people who had built a life together and were raising 2 young children who depended on them every single day. In just a few hours during the early morning of December 30, 2025, that life was taken away. And the people who loved them are now left carrying memories instead of moments that should have still been ahead of them. Cases like this remind us that behind every true crime story are real families, real communities, and real lives forever changed. For the 2 children who were inside that home that night, the world they knew will never be the same. Their future will now be shaped by the strength of the family and community surrounding them. As the legal process continues, many people in Columbus and across the country will be watching closely to see how the justice system responds to a tragedy that shocked so many. But for now, the most important thing is remembering the lives that were lost. Remembering Monique, remembering Spencer, and remembering that every story like this leaves a lasting impact far beyond the headlines. If you found this case important, let us know what you think in the comments below. Do you believe investigators uncovered the full story behind what happened that night? And before you leave, tell us where you're watching from today. Our community is growing around the world, and we always want to see where our viewers are joining us from. If you want to continue exploring real investigations and true crime cases like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next case.